I secretly attended my daughter's wedding. What her in-laws said left the entire room silent. They told me I wasn't welcome at my own daughter's wedding. So I put on a gray wig, borrowed my neighbor's cane, and sat in the back row anyway. I watched my daughter walk down the aisle without me. And then, during the reception, I heard the groom's mother lean over to a table of relatives and say the words that changed everything. Words she never meant for me to hear, because as far as she knew, I was already dead to this family. My name is Victoria, I'm 72 years old, and before I tell you what happened at that reception hall, and what I did about it in the weeks that followed, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now because this story is long and it is real and you are going to want to remember how it ends. Subscribe if you haven't already because I have more stories like this one, stories about women my age who were underestimated by people who should have known better. And type in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. I like knowing who's sitting with me while I tell this. Let me back up. My daughter's name is Ellen. She is 34 years old and for most of her life it was just the two of us. Her father left when she was 4, and I raised her alone on a schoolteacher's salary in a small house I paid off, dollar by dollar, over 22 years. I know what that house cost me. Every fence I mended myself, every winter I turned the heat down to 58 degrees, so there'd be enough left over for her piano lessons. I am not telling you this to sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because you need to understand what kind of foundation I built under my daughter so you understand how strange it felt when that foundation started to crack. About 3 years ago, Ellen met a man at a work conference. I'll call him her husband because I don't need to use his name for you to understand who he is. He came from money, not old money, but the kind of new money that likes to remind you it's money. His family owned a chain of dental practices across 2 states, and his mother, who I will call his mother, ran that family the way some women run corporations. Everyone answered to her, including eventually my daughter. First, I liked them. I want to be fair about that. His mother invited me to lunch when they got engaged, and she was warm, almost too warm, complimenting my cardigan, asking about my years teaching 3rd grade. I remember driving home that day feeling relieved. I thought, good, Ellen has found a family that will take care of her the way I always tried to. I did not yet understand that taking care of her meant something very different to that family than it meant to me. It started small. Ellen stopped coming to Sunday dinners because his mother likes to host. Then Ellen stopped calling as often, because apparently phone calls during the week were overwhelming for the family calendar. Then, about 8 months before the wedding, Ellen sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped her with fractions and college essays, and told me that his parents felt it would be best if the wedding stayed immediate family and close family friends only, and that given the size of the venue they had to make some difficult decisions about the guest list. I asked her as gently as I could if I was on that guest list. She looked at her hands. She said his mother felt that since I was divorced and had, in her words, a complicated relationship with formal events, it might be easier for everyone if I sat this one out and joined them for a smaller family celebration afterward. A complicated relationship with formal events. I taught 3rd grade for 31 years. I have attended more formal events than that woman has had hot dinners. I want to tell you that I fought for myself that day. I didn't. I sat very still and I said, of course, sweetheart, whatever makes things easiest, because that is what mothers do when they sense their daughter is caught between 2 loyalties and don't want to make the rope pull any tighter. I drove home and I cried in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside, because I did not want my neighbors to see. But here is the thing about being underestimated for 72 years. You learn to listen. You learn to watch. And something about the way Ellen said his mother felt instead of we felt told me this wasn't my daughter's decision. This was a decision being made about my daughter, and about me by people who had decided I was a loose thread to be trimmed off a very expensive dress. So I didn't fight. I planned. I have a dear friend, Josephine, who I taught alongside for 19 years, and Josephine has a daughter who does theatrical makeup for the local community college. I told Josephine what had happened, and instead of telling me to let it go, she asked me one question. Do you want to see your daughter get married? Or do you want to make a scene? I told her I only wanted to see my daughter get married. I never wanted a scene. I wanted to witness the one day I had been planning for since Ellen was 6 years old and told me she wanted a wedding with 100 white doves. And then I wanted to go home quietly and let her have her day with the family that had chosen her over me. Josephine's daughter gave me a gray wig 2 shades lighter than my natural color, soft framed glasses that changed the shape of my face, and taught me how to walk with a slight list to one side using a cane, the kind of walk that makes people look away rather than look closer, because nobody wants to be caught staring at an old woman's hip. I told the front of house coordinator when I arrived at the venue that I was a family friend of the bride's, a former colleague of her mother's, which was true in a way that let me sleep at night. I sat in the back row on the groom's side, where I knew none of Ellen's few actual friends would be seated, and I watched my daughter marry a man in a church that smelled like lilies and money. I will tell you honestly, if you have ever hidden in the back of a room to watch someone you love do something beautiful without you, you know there is a particular kind of pain in it. I watched her walk down that aisle in a dress I never got to help her choose, and I cried behind a stranger's glasses, and no one around me thought anything of an old woman crying at a wedding, because old women cry at weddings. That is what we are for, apparently, in the eyes of people like that. The ceremony was lovely. I will give them that. The reception was held in a converted barn with exposed beams and hanging string lights, the kind of venue that costs more per hour than I made in a month of teaching. I found a seat at a table near the back, close enough to the head table that I could watch Ellen laughing, but far enough that no one paid me any mind. I was just another elderly guest nibbling at chicken and asking the waiter for more water. About an hour into the reception, after the toasts, his mother came and sat 2 tables away from me, at a table with 3 of her sisters and a cousin, all of them dressed like they were auditioning for a magazine spread about tasteful wealth. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want to be honest with you about that. I was simply sitting quietly, the way old women in the back of rooms are trained by the world to do, and sound travels strangely in barns with high ceilings. She had a glass of champagne in her hand, and her voice had that particular looseness that comes after the second glass, when people start saying the true things instead of the polished things. She said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, well, thank God we handled the mother situation before it got messy. Can you imagine that woman standing up during toasts going on about how she raised Ellen alone, making everyone feel sorry for her? We did Ellen a favor, honestly. Some people just don't know how to sit quietly and let their children move up in the world. Her sister laughed and said something about how some families are just better fits than others, and his mother nodded like she just delivered a piece of wisdom instead of an insult, and then she said the part that made my whole body go cold and still at the same time. She said, I already talked to my lawyer about the house situation, in case the mother tries to leave anything complicated to Ellen later. We want everything routed through us, clean, no strings from that side of the family. It's better for everyone if Ellen's future is built on our foundation, not some old rundown teacher's pension. I sat very still. I did not gasp. I did not drop my fork. I have spent 31 years learning how to keep my face perfectly composed while a room full of 9-year-olds tests every boundary I have. And that training served me well in that moment, because what I heard was not simply cruelty. It was a plan. That family was not merely excluding me from a wedding. They were quietly working behind my daughter's back and behind mine, to make sure that whatever I had spent my life building would never legally reach Ellen without passing through their hands first, and to make sure I would be so socially erased from Ellen's new life that I would never even notice it happening until it was too late to stop. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who believes family should never treat an elder like an inconvenience to be managed, type still watching in the comments right now, because I want to know how many of you are sitting with me for what happens next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what I did over the following 6 weeks is the part of this story that I am proudest of in my entire life. I did not confront her at that reception. I want to be very clear about why. A woman like that wants a scene. A scene gives her a story to tell forever, about the unstable, embarrassing mother who ruined her son's wedding. I was not going to hand her that gift. I finished my chicken, I watched my daughter cut her cake, and I left before the dancing started, and I drove home in the dark with the radio off, thinking harder than I had thought in years. The following Monday I called my own lawyer. Not a family lawyer, not anyone connected to that world. A woman named Ruth who had helped me with my will 8 years earlier. Sharp as a tack, doesn't waste words. I told her everything, including what I'd overheard. Ruth asked me one question that reframed my entire plan. She said, Victoria, what do you actually own? And what does Ellen actually know that she'll inherit? And that's when I realized the beautiful, quiet irony of the whole situation. That family had spent months maneuvering around a threat that didn't exist in the way they imagined. They pictured me as some fragile, resentful old woman with a modest house and a pension, Someone whose only asset worth routing around was a small inheritance they wanted to control. What they did not know, because I had never told Ellen because I am a private person who does not talk about money at dinner parties, is that my late brother, who worked in commercial real estate for 40 years and never married, had left his entire estate to me 11 years ago when he passed. I had quietly invested it, lived exactly as I always had, in my same small paid-off house, driving my same reliable used car, because that is who I am. I was never going to change how I lived. But I was, as of that Monday morning, sitting on considerably more than a teacher's pension, and considerably more than that family had any idea existed. Ruth and I spent the next several weeks doing something I found deeply, quietly satisfying. We restructured everything. I moved my estate into a trust with very specific ironclad language, naming Ellen as the sole and direct beneficiary, structured in a way that could never be touched, redirected, or routed by any spouse, any in-law, or any lawyer that family might hire, now or in the future. Ruth built protections into that trust that would make it legally impossible for anyone but Ellen herself to access a cent of it, and even then only under terms that protected her, terms that would activate extra scrutiny if large sums ever moved out of her name shortly after being deposited in. I was not trying to control my daughter from beyond the grave. I was trying to make absolutely certain that no one else ever could, either. Then I did the second thing, the thing I am even more proud of. I wrote Ellen a letter. Not an angry letter. Not a guilt-soaked letter. I wrote her the truth calmly, the way I used to explain to a frightened third grader why the math actually did make sense once you saw the whole problem instead of just the piece in front of you. I told her I had attended her wedding in disguise, and I told her why I felt I had to. I told her what I heard at that reception table, word for word, exactly as I heard it, without embellishment, because the truth needed no embellishment. And I told her about the trust, about her uncle, about the plans Ruth and I had put in place, and I told her that none of it was about punishing her or driving a wedge into her marriage. It was about making sure that whatever happened in her life, whatever pressures or manipulations she might face down the road, she would always have one door that stayed open only to her, one foundation nobody else could put their name on. I mailed that letter instead of calling because I wanted her to be able to read it in private, to sit with it, to decide for herself what she believed, without my voice or my emotion pushing her one direction or another. She called me 4 days later. She had been crying, I could hear it, but it wasn't the kind of crying I expected. It was relief. She told me that since the wedding, small things had already started happening that unsettled her, comments from him about simplifying finances, a joint account he'd pushed to open that somehow only he had full access to, little redirections that she'd been quietly explaining away to herself because she loved him and didn't want to believe what she was starting to see. My letter didn't create suspicion in her. It gave a name to something she had already, quietly, painfully, begun to suspect. If you've ever had that feeling, where someone else finally says out loud the thing you've been too afraid to say to yourself, tell me in the comments, because I think more of us have lived that moment than we ever admit out loud. What happened over the following months, I'll tell you honestly, wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was slower and, I think, more powerful than that. Ellen started asking questions. She started requesting her own copies of documents. She quietly opened an account in her name alone, something her grandmother, meaning me, had apparently always told her every woman should have regardless of how happy her marriage was, advice I did in fact give her at 16 and never expected her to actually remember. She began coming to Sunday dinners again, first once a month, then twice, and eventually most weeks because, as she told me over pie one evening, she said, "Mom, I missed feeling like I didn't have to perform being someone else's version of a good wife." His mother, as far as I know, never learned that the old rundown teacher she dismissed at that reception table had quietly built a trust so protective that not $1 of it will ever pass through her family's hands, no matter what happens in that marriage, no matter what happens to me. She never learned that her careless words, spoken over a second glass of champagne to a table of sisters who agreed with her, were heard by exactly the person they were spoken about. I never confronted her. I never sent an angry letter. I never made a scene at a single family gathering since. I simply, quietly, made certain that her plans crumbled under their own arrogance, without her ever understanding why. I still see Ellen every week now. Some Sundays her husband comes and I am polite to him because my daughter loves him, and my job is not to make her choose between us, it's to make sure she never has to choose, because she'll always have her own ground to stand on regardless of what he does. I don't know how their marriage will unfold in the coming years. That's not mine to control, and I stopped trying to control what wasn't mine a long time ago. Back when I was raising a little girl alone and learned that the only thing you can really build is a strong enough foundation, and then you have to trust the person standing on it. But I'll tell you this. I am 72 years old. I taught 3rd grade for 31 years, and if there is one thing 3 decades in a classroom teaches you, it's that the quiet ones in the back of the room are usually paying far closer attention than anyone gives them credit for. That family looked at me and saw an inconvenience, a complication. Someone who didn't know how to sit quietly and let her daughter move up in the world. What they didn't understand is that I have been sitting quietly and watching carefully my entire life. And quiet women who watch carefully are not weak. We are simply waiting for the moment when watching turns into knowing exactly what to do. If this story meant something to you, if you know an Ellen, or if you are an Ellen, or if you are a Victoria sitting in the back row of your own family's life feeling erased, I want you to like this video and subscribe because I have so many more stories to share with you and I want to keep telling them. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and tell me honestly, would you have done what I did? Or would you have done something differently? I read every comment and I will be here waiting to hear from you. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.